to which others should defer, as some courts have suggested, as I believe the current legal advisor has suggested, despite the fact that, as I think you've acknowledged, it really is a group from Switzerland, which is a delightful country, but a parochial view, perhaps, of the world, being a famous neutral. And particularly when we compare deferring to their view and deferring to the United States, which, precisely because it is the global hegemon, has the greatest interest in the peace and prosperity of the law and in the proper prosecution of war.
Thanks for the question, because actually, the ICRC doesn't consider itself an NGO, and it's not an international organization. And why do I say that? And it goes exactly to your question of what kind of authority does it have. Well, actually, in the 4 Geneva Conventions that the U.S. is party to, and so is every other country in the world, it actually gave specific roles to the International Committee of the Red Cross. One example is to visit prisoners of war. So the ICRC likes to consider itself sui generis. And there is, so unlike other NGOs, it actually has a basis in treaty for much of what it does. Other than that, yeah, it's an organization that has been around since the late 1800s. It started an initiative with the Swiss government to encourage the Swiss government to get diplomats from different states together to form what turned out to be the first Geneva Convention to protect the war wounded on the battlefield. So it has a long history associated with the development of the law of armed conflict. To that extent, it has a certain expertise, but it's an expertise that states can disregard. I have had, almost done, I've never quite figured out how to react to this when a state says to me, when I was a legal advisor at ICRC, don't say anything because states listen to you. Okay, but then why do they? Maybe because it is good to have a certain amount of expertise, and it's not just on the law. So keep in mind, some of these organizations, they're not just speaking about the law, but ICRC has worked in conflicts all around the world, and what it mainly does is provide humanitarian aid.
If you look at that 3-volume study that the ICRC produced on the customary law of international armed conflict, they constantly cite, well, Amnesty International said this, and Human Rights Watch said this, and the ICRC has said this, and they treat that as somehow constitutive of customary law, which makes total sense if your perspective is humanity is giving itself a law, and these are agents of humanity which are kind of involved in the lawmaking process. They have gone way beyond the idea that this is based in specific agreements between states. They really like the idea that custom can be made by talking groups like the ICRC and Amnesty International.
Briefly, Olson.
So let's just take the ICRC example as a good one here. I think it's key to remember what Laura said, is that it's created by treaty. So to the extent the U.S. has ratified the Geneva Conventions, which in turn create the ICRC, the U.S. has consented and played a role in creating the ICRC, number one. Number two, what the ICRC said is not sort of like a dictate that comes down on high, the U.S. then has to carry out without any kind of decision-making on the part of the U.S. Not at all. To the extent that we consult the ICRC, it's simply because it is the body that is charged with the duty of interpreting the international legal obligations to which we have consented. And so it's worth finding out what they think. Justice Scalia even has said that it is appropriate to look to what others who are members of the treaty and the treaty bodies charged with interpreting the treaties to learn what the treaty obligations entail. And that's the way in which they're being consulted. So again, to say ICRC is running our detention policy, that's absurd and simply not true. It's that the United States, in trying to figure out what its treaty obligations are, consults bodies whose entire job is to interpret those very treaties and those bodies that we played a role in creating.
Okay. The job is not to interpret those
treaties.
treaties.
All right, Laura, Jeremy, the table on the left. Jeremy accepted. I'd like everyone to thank our really wonderful panelists.